Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this segment of the series. Today, I've got Karen Walstra with me, and she is going to be speaking about bias in education. Karen is an EduTech specialist. She's been working in the education sphere for a long time, and she is extremely experienced and works with digital teaching and learning. She works at different kinds of digital learning and teaching, including unplugged, online, and just digital in general. So Karen, could you tell us a bit more about what you do, please?
So I suppose I always say to people, I play. I think, first of all, education should be fun and engaging and interactive. And so I predominantly work with schools and with teachers in terms of how do they integrate technology effectively into every subject that they teach or every lesson that they're teaching. So it's not just an add-on, but it's a value to both the teacher and the children. And I think that's really important, that the teachers see value in why they're using the technology, not just they're using it for the sake of using it.
Could you tell us a bit more about your experience in the education sector in terms of remote teaching, online teaching, and also just contextualize for the audience the South African context, please?
So I suppose a bit about me. I taught for nearly 30 years. I taught from K, so grade R, all the way through to our year 11s. I've never taught our ending year, school year. And then I've also locumed at a range of different universities. So I've worked within the school space, but I've also worked within the university space. And then alongside of that, I've run teacher workshops for a very long time. First of all, around design and technology, and then around technology like we know it today. And so for me, it's how do we actually empower teachers? So within the South African context, we have 9 provinces or states, for want of better words. And within each of those, we have an urban and a rural area. Some states are obviously more rural than others. Our classes or types of schools also range from being very poor rural type schools to very wealthy schools. So we've got a wide range of sort of professional type teaching spaces, as well as contexts within the socioeconomic space. And I suppose that's like any country, if I compare it to other countries I've been in. I also worked for Google for a few years, and I worked on sub-Saharan projects mainly. So looking at how do we get schools to understand using technology effectively. So for me, in terms of the South African context and why for me education in terms of breaking the bias is so important, it's looking at what are the perceptions that we have of each other as people, and are those perceptions good or bad? Are we really being biased? And then how do we break our bias within that space?
Absolutely. And Karen, I think that you've touched on a lot of interesting concept here, but one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is the bias that you see, particularly towards educators and educators who are not as prepared to work with sort of online or digital learning, remote learning, but because of COVID, people have been now forced to work with that. Is that something that you've seen recently in the last 2 years or so?
So I suppose it's really differed from schools to schools. So you saw where schools who had adopted technology and the teachers were comfortable with the technology and they had the devices, their students, their school almost carried on seamlessly. The kids understood it. They'd been using it both at home and at school before then. It just meant that it became more from a school side. There were negatives to that, even in those kinds of schools, with keeping children engaged, difficulties of children doing tasks at home, not being able to always have the social interaction that they wanted, children missing that. So there were those kinds of negatives. But the other side was the other extreme, where schools didn't have the technology. So sometimes it wasn't that the teachers didn't want to teach online. It was that they'd never been exposed to it. And they themselves didn't have devices, but they were expected to do it. So you saw teachers trying to come up with solutions that could reach both their community, who also perhaps didn't have data, didn't have devices, didn't have all of those kinds of things, saying, well, what can we use? So WhatsApp became quite an important tool in terms of communicating with children who didn't have access, because generally in the home, at least one person had a phone that had WhatsApp on it. So teachers would then try and engage with that. But I can remember speaking to a principal who was in absolute tears because they thought the lockdown would be about 2 weeks long. So they printed materials for about 2 weeks. And then they weren't allowed back in their schools. They weren't allowed to print more materials. They couldn't get materials to their teachers or to their children. So it wasn't always that they didn't want to. It was sometimes circumstances didn't allow it. They didn't have the knowledge. So to learn how to do remote learning without a device and not having data, I mean, that's almost impossible.
Yes, and what was the adoption like sort of pre-COVID? So I worked with a lot, well, I did work a lot with people who were learning about e-learning and e-books. Yes. Pre-COVID, and you could see that people were battling with the technologies, especially I'm talking about teachers in schools, yes. But also lecturers,
yes,
TVET lecturers in particular. So you would see that there was almost a fear around how this is actually going to work and how this would actually, how blended learning would work in their classrooms. So, you know, that you could definitely see that there was favoritism towards traditional modes of learning, traditional methods of learning. And this new technology that we were introducing or asking them to use, you know, platforms like Moodle or Blackboard or whatever the case may have been, people were really battling to grasp that concept and then also to adopt it. So yeah, I mean, I still recall having to support a lady who was using a mobile phone and she couldn't quite understand how this translates. So that's a kind of thing that we need to also just bear in mind as we work with blended learning in particular. Is that something that you found as well?
Oh, I think definitely. I think one of the first things we should do is show people value for their subject. So we shouldn't just be using technology for technology's sake, but we should be saying, so where are the resources that are beneficial to my school or my context or my subject? So for example, if somebody's teaching science, are they aware of simulations that they could be using, or virtual labs or things like that that the teachers could be using? If you're teaching geography, or are you looking at resources that relate to that you could be looking at maps and things online? And sometimes it's you don't know what you don't know. And so it's almost teaching the lecturers and the teachers how to find resources that are relevant to them so they see value. For example, using auto-marked assessments, but they're not just auto-marked assessments with knowledge and recall questions. How do I make those questions go up into higher order thinking, even though most of them could be auto-marked? Can you actually use a form or a survey or whatever you call it as both half-marked and half unmarked? So teaching them that there's this flexibility within the space that can customize it for the way they lecture or the way that they teach. And I think sometimes we forget that step. And so we just assume that everybody should see the value, or everybody should just begin to know to use this tool. So we'll say to them, oh, look, on Blackboard or Moodle, there are all these features, but they're just words unless you've actually begun to explore what those are and how you actually use them. What's a chat? Why do I need a chat in my classroom? I don't want my children to chat, or I don't want my students to chat. Whereas you're saying, no, but this is a great collaborative tool. Do you use WhatsApp? How do you use what? Well, think of that now in terms of your lessons, how you can get your students to be commenting on. How can you do a peer review using a chat kind of feature? Or so really getting people to think around the relevance for themselves, I think, is the first starting point, because if you find it relevant and it's going to save you time, then you'll use it. Whereas I think lots of them think you're just adding more to my load. You're making it more difficult. Yeah. So I saw a lot of that before COVID. Definitely. I think now people are beginning to say, okay, we see the value. They've learned a whole lot. Yeah. So I think in some ways, teachers and lecturers who've been doing online are very tired still at the moment in terms of the ramping up of learning, the engagement, all those kinds of things.
Yes, and I think that, in addition to just the exhaustion from COVID and the stress that has been associated with that, especially with teachers or educators. So what we've seen as well in South Africa is the infrastructure challenges, particularly when it comes to things like electricity and internet connectivity. So, you constantly have power outages, or perhaps there's a problem with Wi-Fi. And in rural areas,
Exactly.
there just isn't any connectivity whatsoever.
Yeah.
Now
And
we're
maybe no electricity as well.
Yes. And now we are saying to educators, listen, we've got all these wonderful tools and we'd like you to use them, but how would they be able to use them if they actually don't have the resources? So you could see almost a lot of frustration towards that, and people saying, well, then I would rather use my traditional methods that I've always trusted in my classroom rather than try to use blended learning when I actually can't access anything that I need to, or I can't even refer my students to look at a map, for example, or to look at a table, or whatever the case is. It obviously would vary according to subject, but that's also a challenge that South Africans in particular face.
Exactly. And I think that it's really, really sad in terms of why teachers are not exposed to it. So if you think about the technology that's available, why can some schools have it and not others? And for me, I think that's where the ball's been dropped quite a few times, where we should have access. Teachers should, whether you're living in the most rural space or you're in a city, you should at school at least be able to have Wi-Fi and connectivity and access to devices. Even if it means you're sharing, you should still be being able to be exposed to it, not that you don't have any access at all.
Yes. Karen, could you speak a bit about the bias that you've seen learners or students display towards blended learning or just online learning in general?
So I suppose it's also differed from children to children. So I was actually talking to a lady who lives in a very rural area and who used the WhatsApp for her grade 11 and 12 children for matric maths, and how she said they just loved it. They were so engaged and participated, and even children who didn't have phones, these children would somehow get to these other children, and she was getting, so the work came via another child and they were photographing the homework they'd done. She would then mark the work and send it back to the children, all using photographs. Editing, I suppose the editing of pictures features became really useful and became almost like a marking tool to send back to students. And the crazy thing with that was that what the teachers were saying was that the children didn't end at the end of a school day. So what she was finding was that at 11 o'clock, she was getting queries from children saying, oh, I'm busy working on this now. Can you help? And so I suppose from a teacher point of view, the school day just became so very long, because it didn't then end when a normal school day ended and you could carry on with work, or you would get all the marking at the same time and you could slowly mark through it at once. So if I think from a bias point of view, it very much varied on, even from teacher to teacher rather than school to school, because you might have in that same school, you might have another teacher who's just not prepared to even look at WhatsApp, and so her children just weren't contacted at all. So the bias for me was a very, I suppose, individual thing that I saw. And it's saying, how do we address that within ourselves? Are you as a teacher being accountable when you're saying, I'm not making any effort to contact my children because I can't? And is that an acceptable answer as a teacher? On the other side, you had the same thing with children and parents, where some children and parents got very involved and others didn't think of it as important. And in fact, at the one little school that I visited earlier last year, yes, the teachers were saying that they had some children who just gave up and decided they were not going to go back to high school because they just couldn't cope with the virtual learning. They didn't understand the concepts. They couldn't speak to the teacher to really get to understand the concepts. They didn't always have the data because their families couldn't afford it. So even though they were using WhatsApp, they couldn't communicate. So I think it's a very difficult situation, and there's not a right or a wrong answer for me. It's looking at various scenarios and saying, how do we assist?
Absolutely. And Karen, sorry, so you said that you wanted to share a presentation. Can I now make you the host so you can do that? Me.
Thank you. So let's see if I can find it. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
So for me, I think if we look at the breaking the bias point of view from an education point of view, it's actually looking at the teachers and saying, how do teachers see teachers? Is there a bias within that? And I think it's how do we then break that bias within the school context? So for me, I think breaking the bias is really complex, just looking at the topic as a whole. Bias comes through the kind of religion we brought up with, the cultures that we are exposed to, the patriarchy that's around us in all sorts of different ways, the traditions that we have as families, as communities, as schools, as all those kinds of things, our beliefs, our value systems, even outside of what religion might be. Then our own family values and norms that we have, their biases within those, whether we like it or not, we have a perspective. And so all the different perceptions that within that. So for me, it's like interwoven into this fabric of society, this bias. And how do we actually then take it apart within that space? So if we think of teachers, who do we think of when we think of a language teacher? What is the bias around there? Do we favor some more than others? Do we assume, oh, language teachers are female, or do we assume it's a male? Or if we talk about an art teacher, what's the stereotype there? Or who do we see as the science teacher, or the history teacher, or the maths teacher? And so should we be questioning our own biases and saying, should we think like this? Should we look at our norms and change that? And then how do we consider teachers? So who do we see as the considerate teacher? Is it always the lady? Is it always a man? Who do we see as the considerate person, or the kind teacher, or the aggressive teacher, or the organized teacher? So for me, these images were interesting in that in two of them, they had females with canes. But from a bias point of view, you always think of the men hitting the children. But is that really true? And the men are holding the books. And is that always true? Are the men's lessons always better than the women? Or are the women's lessons better than the men's? So what are the biases that we have within our own perceptions around who is the teacher, and what does the teacher actually look like? And how do we break that bias? And then if we think of the way schools are structured, and what do we see in terms of leadership and the teachers? So who do we see as a principal? Is it a male? Is it a female? And how do we perceive them? Is a male better? Is a female better? What is the perception around that? And are they good leaders, whichever the bias is? And do we see the principal as the bully? Or do they have favorites? Or do they have favorite subjects? And so then who teaches the sport? Like, is it only the men? Is it only the women? Is it a mixture of both? Maybe you don't teach sport because no, this is your role. And then what about budget allocations? Are there favorites? And therefore it affects what resources you can get into your classroom. And so for me, those are really interesting things that we need to explore within a teaching space. And then if we look at the roles, do we see male and female teachers treated the same? Are their salaries the same? Are their workloads the same? If you are head of department, do you have the same kind of workload, or do you have more just because you're a head? And if you're a grade teacher, do all the grades teachers, or all the people of the same subject, do they have the same load? So how do we break the bias that everybody's treated equally? And is everybody listened to? Or do you have to be on a certain status within the school to actually get listened to? So for me, I think it's complex. whether it's a general bias or an education bias, but it's how do we actually address that? And for me, the thing that addresses it is beginning the conversation. So it's how do we see each other as a collaborative within a school space, working together, whoever we are, and that it actually doesn't matter in terms of what role we see ourselves as. So some people say women teachers work harder than men, but do they? And we need to ask that question really honestly. And is any kind of teacher welcome in the school? Does your gender bias come into effect? Yeah, that it might actually affect whether you get a job or not. And how do we then consider teachers who might be in wheelchairs or might be deaf but want to work in a normal school because they've got a hearing aid? Or how do we actually remove those kinds of biases? And for me, it's how do we begin the conversation? What's the conversation that we have to break down the bias? Doesn't matter what you're teaching or how you're teaching and who you are, but I think it's important to have the conversation to break down the bias. So for me, to break the bias, we need to actually say, how do we as teachers see each other? How do we relate to each other? How do we respect each other? How does leadership in school respect all the teachers? I know I've been to conferences, and it was a global conference, where as a woman, I was not treated the same as the men were treated. So how do you break that kind of bias? That I have as much knowledge as you. We might not be the same, but we should be able to listen to each other and respect each other. And for me, yep.
Sorry to interrupt you. So could you just elaborate on that a bit about, how you were treated differently and why, and at the conference in particular, and what the conference was about, if you can remember?
I can, but I don't know if I want to say it's too yeah. So it was a boys' school conference. It was in the States. And as a woman going to that conference, we were part of the discussions, but whenever you went to the tea groups, you were expected to go and stand with the ladies. You couldn't go and talk to the men. And it was just really weird from what I was used to here at home in South Africa, where I was at a boys' school and you were treated similarly in terms of you could go up to any of the men teachers and have a chat or ask an opinion. So if you'd been in a workshop and you'd engaged with somebody, it was a bit weird. And for me, that was really strange. And I think the only bias there was that I was a lady, that I wasn't a man. And I think that's what we need to just be aware of. Like, how are we actually engaging with each other? And so I suppose the thing for me is with what you're saying, it's we begin with the conversation and it all begins with ourselves. So how do we actually start that conversation? How do we actually engage with that from that point of view? So there's lots of bias, and how do we address it ourselves?
Yes, absolutely. So you've touched on some really important points there, and I just wanted to ask a couple of questions around that. So cool. In terms of the bias that you encounter every day, what is the one that you would say is sort of all pervasive and that you find really challenging right now?
I suppose in reality, I don't face many biases anymore myself. And I suppose it's because over the years, I've just become assertive. So I'm happy to start the conversation and say to people, are we aware of it? And I suppose part of my role or what I do now is I actually talk to schools or help schools who are looking at their strategic planning and their vision and that kind of thinking. And in doing that, these kinds of discussions come up. So who gets trained? How does everybody get trained in terms of a new technology or a vision for the school, or don't leave people out? And in fact, I think if you're introducing technology at school, even the people like the cleaners and the gardeners should be made aware of it, because if you're going tech, they should be getting messages via the tech, so they should know it and they should have access to it. So I think for me, it's having that conversation. And at the beginning, it might be difficult to have, but I think the more we have the conversation, the more of the barriers we break down. Because I think if we keep quiet, we also don't learn other people's perspectives. So I think the minute you start a conversation, somebody else will say, well, I don't agree with you because of this and this and this. And somebody else will say, yeah, but in our house, we do it like that and that and that. And the more we start having those kinds of conversations, the more we understand each other. And I think that's what's important from wherever it is. If you think about people who live in the city compared to people in rural areas, the city might say, no, rural areas are dreadful. We don't want to go there. And the rural people will say the same about the city. But if we actually put these people together, that they actually started talking to each other, they would begin to see each other's points of view and therefore would break down the biases and the stereotypes and the things that where we don't see each other sort of respectfully, that we realize that we're different and it's okay that we're different and that we value each other for who we are, I think is important.
Indeed. And so in terms of the bias that you encounter with regard to remote learning, online learning, digital learning,
Yep.
What would you like to, I suppose what I'm asking is, what myths would you like to be debunked about those types of learning? I think perhaps maybe one of them is the fact that they're quite inaccessible, or that it sounds like it's a good idea, but it's not really practicable in some cases. And I think that what South African educators in particular are working towards is showing and showcasing the world that despite our challenges with electricity or infrastructure of whatever kind, we are still making it work, and we can make it work. And there are service providers who are willing to help us get connectivity to the people who need them and get mobile devices in the hands of children who need them as well.
I want to go back to your first statement about a bias. So for me, I think one of the biggest biases, don't say because the teachers are old, they don't want to learn the technology. I think that's a huge myth. I think teachers are willing to learn, they just need to see the value. And the other thing is where they say, oh, the young teachers love it. That's also a myth. It really depends on the individual and whether they want to learn. And they're young teachers who don't want to touch technology, whereas they're old teachers who just thrive on it. So I think it's looking at the individual and saying, how do we get access? How do we get the electricity and the devices to them? How do we show them the value? So if we go back to what you were saying just now about the difficulties, yes, there are difficulties, but how do we then help people to find solutions? Because I think the other crazy thing that we often hear is, oh, but there's no solution. There's no solution. Whereas in school, what we're trying to promote is children to be critical and creative thinkers. So why are we not then throwing that ball into the teacher's court and saying, how can we help you? Come up with a solution and let's see what we can do to help you. And remove those stereotypes of, oh no, there's nothing to do. Because in reality, that's not true. Look at some of the highest or best maths and science marks are in very rural schools. Those are teachers who are working very hard, just in a different way and getting results. So how do we learn from those kinds of scenarios? And how do we create an environment or a space where people are excited about school and want to see it grow and start mobilizing communities? Another stereotype I think about teachers for me is that where teachers are seen to be inferior. And that's not true. Teachers have been to university. Teachers have qualified. So they have a qualification. But sometimes the worst enemy is the teacher. They don't see value. They don't say to children, become teachers. But if you think of any of us as adults, if we didn't have somebody, and generally that somebody was a teacher who taught you to read and write, you wouldn't be in the profession or doing what you're doing today. So just from that point of view, the value of the teacher needs to be spoken up. And teachers need to say, but we are of value in society. There is a place for us. And so how do we actually promote that? And for me, that bias is something that we really need to take away in terms of that teachers have value. There are good and bad teachers, just like there are good and bad whatever professions there are. And I suppose as individuals, if we think about our schooling, you remember the really great teachers and you remember the teachers who were really horrible to you. We seem to forget the teachers in the middle, but those two really stand out. And even if you ask a teacher, they'll be able to tell you they're worse than their best teachers. And so if we start saying, well, who were our best teachers? Why were they our best teachers? And am I being like that person to that my children who I'm teaching will feel that rather than the negative? So from a bias point of view, there's that. I'm not really answering your question around access, but I do think access is a huge issue. But should it be the responsibility of the teacher themselves? I'm not sure. I think it's a wider, bigger discussion in terms of why are these facilities not in the schools? The budget within the country is really big. And yes, it's got to stretch far, but why are these things not prioritized? The other thing is a school is in a community. So what is the community doing to protect when devices are put in that it doesn't get stolen? So if I think of my own sort of context or things that I'm aware of, where schools have gone in and actually communicated well with the community and said, we're getting new devices, it's going to be a lab, this is how it's going to benefit the kids, this is how it's really meaningful. Those labs have actually been kept safe by the community. They've made sure that the schools weren't broken into or were protected. So it's saying, how does this resource then become valuable to our community, not just to the teachers in the school or the learners in the school? And again, it goes back to bias. I don't think we should paint every school with the same brush. It's like, how is each one separate? And how do we then begin to see our own biases and reflect on those when we're working in different spaces? And the same for those people, how do they see their biases against, say, for example, me or us as individuals, so that we're having the conversation to remove the bias from an individual point of space all the way through to a community space.
Yes, and that's so important. I think that people also assume that nobody wants to work with the community or work with the school community in particular to make this blended learning something that everybody can access and incorporate. And what I've seen also in some rural schools and some rural colleges is that people were actually taking the time to establish libraries where students go, learners could go, and they could access devices, and the devices would be fully charged and have all the apps and things that they needed on them, so that yes, they may not have access at home, but they are making space for these kids or adults to have access to something. And so at least there is a sense of a community and a sense that you can actually access these. I mean, that they're not intangible objects or they're not inaccessible objects. They are actually available. So you can actually get what you need out of them. It's just a matter of working together with your community and with your perhaps school governing body, depending on how your school works, to get this stuff in place.
Exactly. And it doesn't necessarily have to mean, exactly like you were saying, a one device for all. But if it's a face-to-face school and you had a movable trolley that could be for a phase and teachers could sign it out when it suited them, that you begin empowering people so that it's fitting into what they're teaching. And you could say to them, well, you've got to have a minimum of so many lessons a week, but slot them into whatever you like, a maths lesson, a history lesson, English lesson, whatever suits you. And then the same with the learning type devices, for me, that students can take them home. And the way devices can be tracked now and switched on and switched off, there are spaces where they can even take them home. So they can loan them for a day, for a week. I know some universities have a loaning library where students can actually take them for a few days to do a project or for a week. But it can be tracked, so you know your device is safe. the students know that they're accountable for the device and how the tracking works. So everybody knows that they need to be accountable to look after it. But they do that because they realize the value that this can be used on and on again by a range of us. Yes.
Yes. And that's, yeah, and you see that it does actually work in many schools and many universities and many colleges. But yeah, I mean, it has to be a two-way relationship. It's not just one way. There has to be willingness on the side of the educators and the school and the kids or the students. So yeah, I think that is something that's really important. And as you've highlighted, it is happening.
Yeah, I suppose the other thing is that for it to happen, there needs to be trust. And for trust, you need conversations. So if you've had the conversation and everybody understands the perimeters and the sort of the information around it and how it works and why it's of value, and that we can't afford, say, devices for everybody, but everybody can get a chance. And if we look after them properly, it means next year we can actually buy more devices instead of having to replace these devices. If you have those kinds of conversations, it also then removes all the different difficulties because people understand. They're not being given something just for the sake of giving it. They understand where it's coming from and why it's like that.
Yes. And so as an EduTech entrepreneur and as an EduTech business owner, could you talk us through, some of your favorite projects and some of the things that you're working on right now, things that you've spearheaded, to show people, what South Africa is actually capable of and what is happening in the country? We'd love to hear what you've been working on recently.
I'm going to first tell you about a project which is quite old, which I suppose is something that I still hold dear to my heart, even though I'm not involved. It was a teacher development project that started in the early 2000s. I think it was 2006. When I handed it over in 2015, that particular year, there were 1,345 teachers that came on a Saturday morning for teacher workshops. And we had teachers from preschool all the way through to grade 9, focusing on math, science, and technology predominantly. And then in the ECD space, it was how to be an effective ECD facilitator. That was at St. Stithians, and the project is called Tandawazi. The project was so big that we actually then had it up in Limpopo as well, and we had another 400 teachers that came along to Limpopo for the workshop there. So for me, I think it's how do we empower teachers? So teachers came of their own free will. It didn't cost them anything because it was funded, it was corporate funded, but they gave up their time on Saturday mornings. And the attendance rate for those workshops over the year, so there were 12 sessions a year, was about 80 to 85% attendance. So a lot of people, but it was really effective in terms of getting people to realize that we can learn, that even though we are teachers, we can come and we can learn. What we did in the rural areas with the technology is we would actually take devices with us. There were old school devices that we actually turned into cloud devices, and we would take Wi-Fi devices with us. So those rural teachers were also exposed to technology and ideas and things like that. So that's an old project. Some of the new projects are things like working with particular schools and seeing how they're integrating technology and how teachers are just excited and willing to learn. And then looking at the new robotics and coding and how people are really excited about introducing robots, and how even teachers who are teaching foundation phase want to get in on the bandwagon and saying, how can we do this? And teachers are really curious and wanting to learn. So breaking down the stereotype of, no, it's another thing and adding to our load. Teachers are saying, no, we really do want to learn more about this, and how can we learn that? And then just exploring on the other extreme with teachers who are really enjoying playing with alternative or other technologies like AR and VR, and seeing how they can integrate that into their classrooms, So the kids are looking at things not necessarily just from pen and paper point of view, but exploring all sorts of different things. So those are just some of the kinds of projects. And then, yeah, I suppose during the last 2 years, working with teachers on short webinars, on workshops, has just been really fulfilling in terms of seeing how people have engaged, giving them ideas of how to do remote learning. So what's grown out of that is I now have twice a month on a Thursday evening, I have a webinar called All Things Education and Tech. And I chat to different people in a really informal way around either technology or education or a mixture of both kind of solutions. So I suppose it's just engaging with the teachers and just hearing from them how excited they are and getting ideas and trying to look at the positive and help people find solutions, because that's what they're trying to do. They really still want to teach. They really do want to engage with their kids. So it's saying, how can we do this in an easier way? How can we do this in a different way? Yeah.
What advice would you give to anybody who's wanting to go into the EduTech space, bearing in mind our overarching theme of break the bias?
I think whoever you are, don't think of the stereotypes. So be whoever you are and put yourself out over there. So if we keep learning, whoever we are as individuals, I think start with something you really enjoy learning and try that before you actually go into a whole range of different technologies. Enjoy what you're doing, because I think that's really important. And then explore that within your spaces. I think that's what I would say, is be yourself and grow yourself in an area that you perhaps begin as being comfortable with, and then just enjoy what you're doing and learn more about it.
Yes, that's such an important message, isn't it? To actually have fun and realize that you can learn as well. It's not just your job to provide education to somebody else, but you also have to assimilate knowledge for yourself and to work towards something for yourself too.
I think that's very, very important, that especially if we're talking about EdTech, the tech is changing so quickly. So just read, explore, play. The best way with technology is if you play with it, to learn it. So use it. Don't see it as something that's distant, but engage with it.
And keep current, because there are always new updates. And I mean, you're having to get a new device every 2 years, and it's not exactly like the other one. So it is something that you've got to continuously play with, as you say. It's not something that you can just sort of leave at the back of the cupboard, as it were.
It is. And I mean, we do that with our phones. So why can't you do that with other devices, you know? So thinking about how we use them.
Absolutely. Karen, could you tell the audience, please, how best to reach you, and whether you have a website that they can reach you on, or whether they should reach out to you on LinkedIn, and what sorts of things you are willing to support with or mentor them on. Could you talk us through that, please?
So the website that I think, I've got two, but the one I keep more up to date than the other. The one is called Karen Walstra Consulting. It's my older website. The newer one is called Evolve School. It's evolveschool.co.za. And all my SACE endorsed courses and things are on that website. I think I've got more than 20 SACE endorsed courses. So if you're wanting professional development within those spaces, we can do it virtually or face-to-face within your school. Then also on the Evolve School page, there is a services page. So I help schools with strategic planning. So if you know what your vision is, how do we reach that? So having discussions and workshops around that, and perhaps teacher development that builds on that, because I think a vision can't be achieved unless you actually engage with the whole community. And then talking to learning spaces. So what does learning spaces mean? What are classrooms? Should classrooms be a bit different? So talking about that. And then a whole lot of technology type scenarios. So looking at it from technology integration, just generally, all the way through to specifics such as AR and VR or robotics and coding. And then also talking about how do we get children to think? So for me, design thinking is really important in terms of getting children to think, teaching teachers how to actually use design thinking within that space. I was really excited that in this draft technology curriculum, they've actually got 2 methodologies listed, which for me is really great. And that's the design process, which is very similar to design thinking, and computational thinking. They've actually identified as a methodology, which has been interesting to explore, seeing how do we teach it as a methodology, not just as a skill. But I think so I work with schools in terms of meeting their needs. So I don't have a one size fits all. They need to say to me, this is what we would like. This is how we would like it. We have a discussion around that, and then we plot a path.
Awesome. So what I will do is I will share your links as well so that people can get hold of you. And yes, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And I've certainly learned a lot. I'm sure that people will benefit immensely from the discussion that we've had. And I appreciate everything that you have shared with us today. So thank you, Karen, for your time. And yeah, we'll speak again soon.
Thank you so much to you too.
Thanks so